Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight for our Women Who Code Global event with WePay. My name's Jody, and I'm a director at Women Who Code Silicon Valley. And as I mentioned before, we're recording tonight, so if you want to stay anonymous, then use your first name and turn off your video. Then the link for Slido questions is in the chat. And we'll get started. So next slide. Our agenda tonight, brief introduction to Women Who Code, and then the speakers for WePay will speak for about 60 minutes, and then we'll wrap up with a Q&A for 30 minutes. Next, our mission. So our mission is to inspire women in technology careers. We hold many events throughout the year. Our events are free, and they are very inclusive. It's different these days in that all of our events are on Zoom. Next. We started in 2011 as a small community group in San Francisco, and quickly women around the world wanted to be part of the community. And today we're a global footprint of 230,000 and strong and growing. Next. Our code of conduct. Our events are open to anyone who supports our mission. We are an inclusive community, and we ask that everyone be respectful at our events. We don't tolerate harassment of members in any form. And I'd like to introduce Moira with WePay for tonight's event.
Hey, my name is Moira Tegel. I am a staff software engineer at WePay, and I'm going to be acting as sort of the master of ceremonies for this set of presentations. And I know this was provided before, but in case you missed it, here is, we're going to be holding a Q&A afterwards. So if you want to get a head start on questions, we'll list this again at the end, but you can ask questions, vote on questions that you want to see answered, etc. So I want to start off by introducing WePay a little bit. So WePay is a payments processing company. So we process payments and handle regulatory compliance and payouts for our customers. And we were acquired by JPMorgan Chase in December of 2017. And I also want to talk about why you should listen to us. Like, why should you care what WePay has to say about interviewing? So WePay started off with an interview system that's a lot like what is sort of all across Silicon Valley. We only had a small number of engineers who interviewed. There was lots of variation in the quality of the people who interviewed. And there was also no organized system to make sure that all the points that we thought were important to evaluate were covered in an interview. So the end result of this was that there are like a small number of competent interviewers, and even then, sometimes we've had interview panels where the end result was basically gaps in our knowledge of candidates' abilities, which made it very difficult to make a hiring decision, which was all not great. So what we did is we took a step back and we started off by talking about what do we think it is important to evaluate candidates on? Like, what do we want out of the people we hire, and how are we going to evaluate that? And we ended up with what we call our module system. So we have defined modules that evaluate things that we think are important to evaluate in candidates. And so we have these consistent modules that we evaluate all candidates by. And furthermore, we also have interviewer training. So instead of just kind of tossing engineers into interviewing and hoping they get good at it somehow, we actually train all of our interviewers. All of our interviewers are trained with another interviewer who has already gone through this training. And this results in these people learn not only how to conduct interviews, but also how to evaluate people. And this is really important because this results in consistent and unbiased evaluation of candidates. And with this, we can feel much more comfortable with our hiring decisions. And 40% of the engineers that we pay are qualified to conduct interviews, which is very high. And an even greater percent of engineers that we pay are currently in the pipeline to become full-time interviewers. So you should listen to us because we have thought a lot about the purpose of interviewing and how to interview. All right, so this is going to be our agenda for tonight. So we're going to start off with Smita Koduri, who's going to talk about why Silicon Valley conducts interviews for software engineers in the first place.
Hi, everyone. This is Smita, and today I'm going to talk about why does Silicon Valley interview software engineers. Next slide, please. Okay. Before we get started, we all know that when it comes to Silicon Valley, it is loaded with talent, right? So in order to identify the right candidate, the companies have incorporated interviewing as a way for evaluation. So what exactly are the companies looking for during an interview? So the companies are trying to see if a candidate can think and approach a problem. How are they thinking and approaching a problem? And whether they can walk through the pros and cons of different approaches and narrow down to a particular approach. So basically, it is nothing but trying to evaluate a candidate on the skills that an engineer uses on an everyday basis. So let's consider an example. Like suppose if you're working in a company, you might come across a project which is completely new for you and you have no idea how to approach it, right? So how do you solve it? So you try to brainstorm different approaches and try to narrow down to a particular final approach, right? So the same behavior is expected out of the interview as well. So before we dig deep into what are the evaluation criteria that the companies are looking for, let's talk a little bit more about why is it so important for the companies to find the right candidate and what exactly are the pitfalls of hiring a wrong candidate. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. So there are different consequences of hiring a wrong candidate. The first and foremost is the productivity impact. So suppose if you hired a wrong candidate, it'll obviously be a case that you or your manager will be trying to train and retrain the new hire. This might impact the productivity or the business of the company. And the reason being because of this, because you hired someone who is not performing up to their expectation, the other members in the team might have to work extra hours in order to meet the targets and the deadline. So this can eventually impact the productivity. And definitely it also has the financial impact because you're paying salary to someone who is not competent enough. And also at the same time, you are also paying money for their training purposes. And if it comes to a point where you are planning on laying off the employee, you might end up paying the severance package. And other than that, you might also have to incur the cost required for rehiring a new candidate. Other than the productivity and financial loss, the other impact is the reputation. Suppose you have a bad hire, and if they are involved in the client interfacing, then it might damage the reputation or the relationship that the company has with the customer if they are not treated well. So these are a few of the reasons why companies take interview as a very serious way in order to evaluate and make sure that they are hiring that they have like strong evidence in order to hire a right candidate. And also that doesn't mean that if you are not hired and if you didn't get offer, that doesn't mean that you're not capable enough. It's just that during that interview, the interviewers or the panel didn't have enough evidence in order to convince whether you would be a good fit for the position or not. Next slide. So whenever we apply for a jobs or interviews, we always start with our resumes, right? So let's talk about what is the role of a resume in the interview process. Basically, resume is not as important as your performance during an interview because resume can lead you to an interview, but it's actually how well you do in an interview is what would get you an offer. But sometimes like a lot of people end up spending so much time in order to prepare or come up with a perfect resume that they might neglect on preparing for the interviews. So definitely, like, we have come across situations where there are candidates who have like a perfect resume where all the qualities and skills match with what is expected out of a job position, and it ends up that the candidate doesn't do so well in the interview. And we have also come across situations where there are candidates in which their resume didn't match with that, completely match with that of the position, but still they have aced the interview, and they eventually they did perform well also in the job. So that is the reason resume cannot be considered as the main criteria for evaluating a candidate. And like I mentioned before, it's basically how a candidate is performing in an interview is what determines whether they would end up with an offer or not. So let's dig a deep into it and then see what are the skills that an company or an employer is looking for during an interview. Next slide. So definitely, the obvious ones are technical skills and problem-solving skills, because most of the engineering interviews end up having like coding rounds in order to see how is the thought process, like how soon or how well can they think through the approaches and then narrow down to a final approach. Other than these, the other criteria is communication skills, how well the candidate is able to explain their thought process. One of the reasons that it is important is when you're working in a company, you are generally part of a team, or part of a team when you're working on a project, right? So it's not always that you will end up doing like an individual project. So which means you might have to interact with other people in order to discuss what are your thought process, what are why this approach works, why that approach doesn't work. So you should be able to communicate well with your colleagues. So that is one of the skills that the candidate gets evaluated during the interview. And also to see how well the candidate is taking feedback. So these are the few evaluation criteria. So what mechanisms that the companies use in order to shortlist the candidates is generally by having like a screening test. It's generally like online coding test that they send off initially. And once you clear it, it's proceeded with like a phone interview. And once the candidate clears the phone interview, they would be called on site for an on-site interview. Next slide. So till now, we have talked about how companies are evaluating the candidate. But when it comes to interviewing, it's not just one way thing, right? It's a two-way process in which the employer evaluates the candidate and the candidate also evaluates the employer. The reason being, this is interviewing is exactly the place where the candidate gets to interact with people who are working in that company. So which means they can fetch information about the company, what projects they are working on, what is the growth of the company, what are the goals of the company down the line, and all those information. So candidates should generally try to use this opportunity and try to gather as much information as they can about the company in order to make sure or like determine if their career ambitions match with that of the position that is being offered. And also we can generally see that the interview panel generally consists of interviewers from different teams. So try to make use of it and try to get information about different teams so that you can narrow down to whatever you feel like joining to. So with that, I'm going to hand over the presentation to the next presenter.
I was muted. All right, I'm going to hand off the next presentation to Khushbu Mandalecha. She is going to be talking about interviewing in the age of COVID-19.
Thank you, Moira. Hi, everyone. I'm Khushbu Mandalecha, and I'm a senior software engineer at WePay. I work on the reporting and reconciliation team. So interviewing in the age of COVID-19. Since COVID began, there were so many uncertainties, and people who were trying to interview, get new jobs, didn't know how to go about doing remote interviewing. It's a new thing for everyone. It's a new thing for people who are trying to interview. It's a new thing for people who are trying to get new hires for their company. So there are so many things which have changed in the past few months, and I'm going to be talking about just a few tips that you should keep in mind while you're trying to interview in this the new normal that people talk about. So moving forward, let's get the checkpoints for an on-site interview setup. So when you go in an on-site interview, you go to the office, you get to interact with a few engineers on different teams, or let's say if you are interviewing with a specific team, you get to interview with different members of that team. While you're there, you also check out the office environment. You see what are the different teams that are working in the company. When you talk with different engineers or different people from the company, you also ask them, hey, what are the projects that you're working on? And as Smita mentioned, you are also interviewing the company for a good fit when you go inside the office. So you should also think about what is the diversity on different teams, and see if your areas of interest align with the company's interests or company projects. These are just a few things that you should keep in mind in general. And how do you make sure that you get answers to all of these questions when you are in a remote interview setup? So next slide. Okay, so there are a few things that you should keep in mind before you go in an interview. As a normal interview process, you talk to a recruiter or a hiring manager when you are trying to interview with a company. So there are a few things that you should keep in mind. Like, let's say you need to ask a recruiter that, hey, what is the process for a remote interview setup? Most of the companies in Silicon Valley have a virtual coding environment that they have set up so that they can test interviewees on different technical skills. So getting yourself familiarized with that virtual coding environment that they will be testing you upon. It's hard because you need to practice yourself. You need to practice in that virtual coding environment. Become more confident on how you will be able to do the question, as well as interact with the interviewer at the same time. You need to practice. So practice is very, very essential, and getting familiar with the virtual coding environment that you will be writing your code in. So certain things about communication in a remote interview setup is about will it be a video communication, or is it just audio? So make sure you ask all of these questions to your recruiter before you go inside the interview. Some other things that you can do is you can time yourself whenever you have a virtual environment. Since you have some time to practice before the interview is actually going to happen, you can take some time, you can do some practice, you can just do some sample coding and see whether how much time does it take for you to complete a question. So this is all the prep that's required before the interview. Now moving on to the next slide, which I'll be talking about, is what do you do during the interview? So during the interview, there are certain guidelines that interviewers follow while asking you questions. They might spend a few minutes talking about your past work or asking you about your past experiences. So you can also practice about what your past experience. You can also practice and talk about your past experiences. You can time it to a few minutes before you actually go in the interview. Pick up a favorite project, pick up something challenging that you might have done in the past, so that it is exciting for the interviewer as well, and they can ask you some follow-up questions. This is just makes your communication or the interaction much more friendlier, and you just how you connect with a person. It's harder to connect with a person when you are in a video setup. It's not as intimate as you would meet someone in person. So just having a few starter points generally helps when you get into an interview. Other things that I had mentioned before, that make sure that your code pair environment or the virtual coding environment that is being provided by your recruiter, you've set it up before the interview, you have everything ready, so that you don't end up spending a lot of time. Basically setting up everything during the interview, because those minutes that you have lost setting up everything during the interview will harm your interview evaluations. You don't want to do that. So make sure that you have everything set up before the interview. During the interview, other things that you need to keep in mind is let's say you are in a coding round, and I think generally a lot of companies do a lot of coding questions while they are asking you for while they are testing you for technical skills. So how do you ensure that you have prepared enough? Again, as I had mentioned before, prepare on the virtual coding environment, try to time yourself. Other thing that is very important is explaining your thought process. Generally, when you do an on-site interviews, most of the companies have a whiteboarding process where you go and write your solution on a whiteboard. Writing on a whiteboard and typing up your solution are two totally different things. So how do you make sure that while you're typing, your interviewer knows what your thought process is? So a few things that you can do is, before you start typing up your solution, you should interact with your interviewer, asking them certain clarifying questions, asking them for edge cases. You can also type up your solution before you actually get into coding. Also make sure that you ask the interviewer that, hey, what is the expectation at the end of this interview? Are you expecting me to finish coding and try to run the solution and write a unit test? Or are you just expecting me to run and write an algorithm and not run it? Because if it's a code per environment, certain interviews might expect you to actually complete the solution by running the solution and working with a few edge cases or test cases. So that's about during the interview. Now, moving on to the next section, which is after the interview. Now, you've gone through the tiresome interview process. You've been through so many technical rounds. You've spoken to so many engineers. Now, what do you do after you finish the interview? And let's say you get an offer from the company that you're interviewing for. So there are a few things that you should keep in mind while you are trying to talk to your recruiter or hiring manager before you accept an offer. You should ask them certain questions, which is, hey, how do I choose a team if I get an offer? That is a very important thing, because you'll be working with that team for a prolonged period of time, and you want to make sure that you're excited about the team that you will be working with. You want to be excited about the project that you will be working on. So how do you ensure that you get all of these questions answered before you accept an offer? So one thing that you can do is you can ask your recruiter to talk to the different hiring managers before you choose a certain team. You should ask them specific questions about, hey, what is the team size? Like, what is the diversity on your team? What are the different projects that you're working on? What is the goal? What are the different goals that your team or the organization is trying to achieve? So these are a few things that you should keep in mind while you are talking to the recruiter or the hiring manager. Other very important question that you should ask is, if you're talking to a hiring manager or a recruiter, that how are different teams set up for working remotely? As we know that we don't know when this is going to end, and especially companies want to be very, very sure, and they want to make sure that all their employees are in good health. So this might also be a long-term thing, and none of us know that how long remote work is going to last. So you should ask questions to your recruiter that, hey, what is company's long-term plan for remote work? How flexible is the company for remote work even after people start going to office? Will there be an option to choose between working remotely or coming to office mandatory? So these are certain questions that you should ask. Also, during your interview, if you are based out of a different city or a time zone than the normal work hours of the company, you should make sure that you should ask your recruiter or the hiring manager, hey, what are the work timings? Will I be able to work? Do you have flexible work timings, or do you have to work certain hours in a given time zone? So these are certain things that you should ask. Also, another thing that you should ask is, if I join the company, what is the onboarding process? If I onboard, will I be assigned a mentor who I will be working with on a day-to-day basis, or will I be working with different people in the first few months or the first few weeks that I join? So these are just a few things that you should keep in mind before you accept an offer for a certain company. And all the best to all the people who are trying to interview and get a job during the COVID situation. Thank you.
All right, awesome. Okay, so our next presenter is Avani Sharma, who's our Senior Engineering Manager for our Machine Learning team. and she's going to be talking about her perspective as a hiring manager on interviewing.
Hi, everybody. This is Avani Sharma. I am a senior engineering manager, just like Moira said, at WePay, and I really enjoy it here at WePay, a very great and diverse company. Moving on, I'm going to give you a perspective into what I am looking for in my team when I hire. So from a hiring manager's lens, there are a few things which are key, and I think everything else gets, like the technical abilities, etc., get taken care of in many other interviews you do. But the hiring manager's interview is a mix of problem solving, behavioral communication, strategic thinking. So I'll go through a few of those to see if this person fits in to the team really well, and do they really desire to be part of this team. So the number one thing, of course, is end-to-end problem solving, which is what are the big picture skills? Can this person really think strategically? Are they interested in the business domain? For example, a very common question to ask is why WePay? What is the reason you want to join this company? And when let's say we talk about a problem at hand, which could be a current pain point with the company, how does the person try to solve it? Do we go from in a structured way from a simple solution to a complex solution, or do we just try to propose a totally overkill solution? So I think the thought process, the desire to be part of this business domain, thinking of the end-to-end problem from requirements to putting something into production is something that I would like to see in a well-structured way when I'm going through an interview. Many a times, actually, what we hear when we say why WePay is also a lot of word of mouth, saying my friend is there and I've heard great cultural things about the company, for example. So, and I want to be part of that culture and talent pool. So those are good ideas, but further into fintech, etc., would be a plus. On the communication skills, I think it's really important, and I come from a machine learning and data science perspective. So being able to tell the story and not just talk about your solution, your technical solution. So being able to tell a story, being able to communicate and engage to various audiences is really key. So talking your technical jargon can be one, which is great for a paper reading or an engineering reading meetup. But if you have to speak to the business, and often with machine learning solutions, everything is baked into the product or business. So telling the business metrics and applying your work to the business metrics and talking in the layman and the user terms is very important. Able to clearly explain your ideas is I think, obviously, I mean, this is a no-brainer, basically. I mean, the more succinctly you can explain your ideas and get it across to the other person, the better it is for you to shine. Able to incorporate others' feedback. I think it's very important in an interview, especially if you're doing a behavioral piece, to give examples of when you got positive feedback and what you did about it. So how you take feedback, how you understand it, because we always have to remember that the feedback giver is always spending their time in improving our skills. So how you incorporate feedback given by others, and how do you incorporate constructive feedback given by others? So that is a question that comes in quite a bit, where we say, okay, you got challenging feedback. How do you handle that? So having those examples in hand and being able to clearly explain those situations that you went across in your life in your professional career would really help through the interview. Next slide. Okay, and this, I cannot emphasize enough, right? I mean, however good you may be, you need to be a team player, and the teamwork is what will take you further into delivering value for the bigger team. So like it says, there's a greater collaborative power through teamwork. And this is somebody's quote, it's not mine, but what we're trying to say is single-handedly, you cannot really win a whole project. And if you want to be successful, you have to be a team player. And what does a team player really mean? Like, what are the examples that you can give as a team player in an interview? How can you showcase yourself as a team player? I mean, you could have done a lot of collaborative work with different teams globally in your current work. And those are great examples. You could have mentored an intern. You could have arranged brown bags and presented. So I think those are all great points to showcase your team player abilities, behavioral skills, flexibility. It's very common for projects to change course. It could be that one project completely changes into a new project, or the scope of a current project changes significantly. And we should be open to that as long as we understand why that is happening. So positive attitude, behavioral skills, flexibility, and having some examples of those through the interviews really help us understand what kind of a person you are, and explaining them clearly. For example, I can give you an example for collaboration. For collaboration, in my previous work, I was able to globally work with various teams and have them speak for me. And there was like a small collaboration reward that I got. It was, so showcasing those skill sets will really help you sail through the interview with examples as behavioral skills, flexibility, collaboration, and desire to be part of a team. So it should be the fact, if you've learned something about a team, read some blogs, it shows an interest in the team and the work they've done. So if you have some knowledge, so showing that again would help with understanding that you're a team player. Next slide. So not a jerk. This is a very common terminology called brilliant jerk. And you may be brilliant, but if you are pessimistic, if you hinder the productivity of the whole team, if you're negative, if you demotivate people around you, if you dominate meetings. So those are some things that you need to ask yourself, what kind of person you are. And it'll come out in the interview one way or the other. It doesn't change. So those are some things that we need to know about ourselves and self-reflect before we come into an interview. So somebody said, I'd rather have a hole in my organization than an asshole. So which is really right. It means we need to be kind. And be kind means we may feel we are kind, but others have to feel that you're kind. So people around you, how do they feel around you? Do they want to be around you? Do they feel that you include them in meetings in their opinion? Do they feel that they get recognition and credit through you as well for their work? So I think what this is really talking about is your EQ versus IQ. So your emotional quotient versus intelligence quotient. So you need to be empathetic. You need to be really be a person, and should show, and it will come out in the meetings, like I said, in the interview. And I think that is what the interview process is for, the behavioral skills, the hiring manager meetings. It's not uncommon to have people get declined for an interview because of behavioral skills. People are looking for those red flags. So having the right examples again there of helping employees being compassionate would help you sail through the interview. Yeah, so those are some key things I look for as a hiring manager. And as long as we are aware about those, the interviews should go fine and should be, you should have a positive experience as well when interviewing. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Avani. All right. Okay, so the next presentation is by Rupa Hirimat. She is going to be talking about common interviewing mistakes and how to avoid them.
Hi everyone, my name is Rupa Hirimat. I'm a staff software engineer at WePay. Today I'm going to talk about some of the common mistakes the candidates do when doing coding interviews and give some tips on how to avoid them. In each interview, interviewer would be looking for specific data points to make a decision to say yes or no for hiring. Every interview has different outcomes. There are scenarios you may have given a very best solution the very first attempt, but still may not have given all the data point what the interviewer is looking for. Or you may have not reached till the end of the solution, but still may have given the data points what the interviewer wants to see. There are good chances you'll end up with a job in the second scenario than the first one. Now, let's see how to give maximum positive data points to the interviewer by understanding and avoiding some of the common mistakes we do. Next slide, please. Let's see our first mistake. Jumping into code as soon as we hear a problem is a very first mistake we do, usually. When the interviewer poses a question, poor candidates start coding immediately. They think they might be familiar with the problem and start writing code to the problem they think they understand. There are often cases the interviewer might have added a smaller component on top of it, which may totally change the approach and the solution itself. So we need to take a step back. Good candidates usually think about missing requirements, think about edge cases, think through the solution from all aspects, formulate the solution in their head, and then finally transfer it to whiteboard coding. With this, interviewer is trying to collect a specific data point on how well you plan things before acting on them. Let's see the second one. Next slide, please. Ignoring your interviewer is another common mistake. When you are in the interview, you don't have access to ID, no docs and no guys probably. You should remember that your interviewer is your ID. When I say that, what I mean is, interviewer would usually know most possible ways of solving the same problem, and they can immediately identify the direction you are heading towards as soon as they hear you explaining the approach. They may give you useful hints and suggestions to help you guide through the problem and keep you on right track. Good candidates stay attentive to what the interviewer says, take the hints and suggestions and try to incorporate them in their code. In this, interviewer is asserting how well you work with others and how open you are for feedback. Let's go to the next slide. Making assumptions is another thing. So when we are trying to solve a problem, it's very common we do make some assumptions. Poor candidates do make a lot of assumptions and finish coding without validating them explicitly with the interviewer. Later, when they get to know their assumptions are incorrect, they try to rework everything, wasting a lot of time. Whereas good candidates try to understand the problem and its constraints, ask clarifying questions upfront, get their assumptions explicitly validated with the interviewer before proceeding. Once they have good clarity on what is expected out of them, then they think about a solution. Interviewer is trying to assert how you avoid rework and finish the task in a timely manner by getting the right requirements here. Let's see the next one. Not communicating is another common mistake candidates do. Good candidates keep communicating with their interviewer at each stage to keep the interviewer informed about their thought process. Yes, interviewer is definitely interested on how you think and how you approach the problem and how methodical you are. You do not have to keep talking throughout the interview if it distracts you from solving the problem. Silence can be awkward in the interview, but you can avoid it. If you think you need some time to think about a solution, tell that to your interviewer and take a few seconds, think about a solution. Once you have a solution, clearly describe the solution to your interviewer. Finish writing code. Talk about time and space complexity, and again explain your solution, what you have on the whiteboard, to your interviewer. Interviewer can help you point out the missing scenarios and you have not considered by your coding, and also suggest you ways on how to correct it. This is the best chance to signal your interviewer on how you plan things and also how you go about executing them. Next slide, please. Validating your code is very important. Poor candidates just write some code and say, okay, I'm done, without validating their code, letting the interviewer assert it themselves. Whereas the good candidates take validation into seriously. They do validate their code by taking a couple of inputs before presenting it to the interviewer. Formulate test cases, go through the code, make sure the code works as expected and meets the specs what you agreed to. If you find any bugs, please do not go ahead and debug it. It's a great chance to show your debugging skills. If the interviewer points at a problem, don't jump into fixing it. Try to understand it before. Interviewer definitely appreciates if you present them a well-tested code. In this, interviewer is asserting the coding readability skills, trying to assert if you understand the code, what you have written, and also if you can debug it well. Let's go to the next one. The other common mistake many candidates do unknowingly is wasting time. Most of the coding interviews are scheduled between 40 minutes to 1 hour. Interviewer would like to collect as much information as possible within this time frame to make a decision at the end. But many candidates drag and waste time unknowingly by getting into unwanted details. Sometimes they get stuck and go into different mode and stop listening to the instructions given by the interviewer to proceed. So usually good candidates try to maximize the information given from the net by staying focused and following instructions given by the interviewer. Next slide, please. Misinterpreting yourself can be costly, in fact. You need to have a better evaluation of the skills you have expertise on and skills you don't have. Even if you try to undermine these things to get a job, you are setting yourself for failure. It's all about setting right expectations with the interviewer. If you have seen a problem before, tell it to the interviewer. If the interviewer gets sense that you are lying on something, probably they might judge you harshly. Authenticity is important. Don't bluff and be honest. Next slide, please. Not interviewing your interviewer is another biggest mistake, I would say. When you're at the coding interview, you are probably talking to a person who has lived through the job, who has a very first-hand experience on the job you have applied to. So don't miss this opportunity and by not asking questions. Try to ask questions on specific things, maybe about the company's culture, the team, product, tech stack, your roles and responsibilities in the job role, opportunities to learn new things, career ladder, business model of the company. So there could be anything you want to know. All these are also going to be helpful for you to make an informed decision when you're accepting a job offer. So interviewer definitely appreciates if you show interest by asking these questions. And also the interviewer will evaluate you on how well you evaluate them. Next slide, please. The last point I'm touching on is not practicing. When I say not practicing, it's not about solving many problems. It's about solving them with an interview-like environment. When you're at home solving a problem, the only goal you have is to find an optimized solution. Whereas in the interview, you not only have to find an optimized solution, but also have to explain it to the interviewer within a specified time. As I mentioned before, interviews are time bound. So keep a clock when you're preparing and trying to solve a question at home. Prepare on what areas of solution you want to emphasize on when explaining it. You are not given an IDE at the interview, so practice typing outside an IDE, maybe a notepad. Other than coding, there could also be many questions asked by multiple interviewers in each interviews. Some of them are like introduction, previous work, background, questions on technologies you have worked on or listed on your resume, and challenges you have faced and how you have overcome them. So be prepared to answer these questions so that you look precise in the interview. You can land up with your dream job if you practice a bit and avoid these common mistakes. Finally, just stay calm, learn, listen, and reflect. Thanks, everyone.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Rupa. All right, so the next and final presentation is going to be Sarah Kaplan. She's going to talk about interviewing specifically for candidates with non-traditional backgrounds and tips for them.
Thanks, Moira. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah. I work at WePay on the UI UX team as a software engineer. And this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart because before I started my career as a software engineer, I was actually a high school English teacher for about 7 years. And then I attended a full stack web development bootcamp called Rhythm School before I started interviewing for software engineering jobs. And so I know from my personal experience and also from interviewing lots of candidates at WePay That's something that folks coming out of boot camps or candidates who maybe don't have a computer science degree, or maybe they're returning to software engineering after taking a break from work for a while, tend to face a lot of imposter syndrome and worry a lot about gaps in their skills that might come up in the interview. So I'm going to address some of those challenges. So some of the common fears that I think candidates from, all candidates might have, but especially folks coming from non-traditional backgrounds, are handling these different kinds of knowledge gaps in the interview. Maybe the interviewer asks you about a topic or concept that you're just totally unfamiliar with. Maybe you get stuck on the problem and you're not sure how to make progress. Maybe you're just unsure of the syntax that you need to use. So I'll talk about some of those challenges, and then I'll also talk about how to market your previous experience. Next slide. So the first challenge that might come up and is likely to come up if you're doing a lot of interviews is you might get asked a question about something that you're just totally unfamiliar with. And so this is an example that actually happened to me during an interview. I was asked to design and implement a least recently used cache, and I did not know what a least recently used cache was. I wasn't even that familiar at that time with caching. So one thing I want to emphasize about this situation is this does not mean that you are automatically going to fail the interview. If a company is choosing to interview someone coming out of a boot camp or from transitioning from another career, they're aware that you're going to have gaps that you need to fill in when you start your first job. And they're actually very interested in seeing how you learn new skills and apply them. And so you can actually turn this situation into an opportunity to demonstrate that to the interviewer. But in order to do that, you need to be open and honest. So sometimes I see candidates in an interview where it seems like, especially now that we're remote, they might be kind of trying to Google something about the question without asking me if they can Google it. And a lot of times that doesn't lead to a successful interview because they might end up looking at some code that they don't fully understand and trying to kind of implement a solution based on that. It's much better to just be upfront with your interviewer and tell them what you do and what you don't know about that topic. So when I found myself in this situation with the LRU cache, I was just really upfront with my interviewer. I said, I'm not familiar with a least recently used cache. Can you explain to me what that is? I did work on a project where we used Redis for caching, and I know that we were storing some key value pairs there, but I wasn't working directly with the caching logic, and I don't know that much about it. And that's really important because for two reasons. It gives your interviewer a clear baseline so that they can give you a fair evaluation. If the interviewer knows that this is a brand new topic for you, they're going to shift their mindset to say, oh, I'm interviewing a candidate who doesn't know about this, so I'm going to be seeing how they do when I teach them about it for the first time. And they're going to give different kind of feedback than they would to a candidate who's clearly very familiar with least recently used cache. It also helps the interviewer understand, what kind of background information they need to fill in for you so that you can make progress with this problem. Hopefully you'll be interviewing somewhere with an experienced interviewer who's kind of ready to teach you about the topic, but it's possible that you might be doing this interview with someone who's less experienced. And so you also need to be ready to ask really specific questions so that you can gather all the information that you need in order to understand this unfamiliar concept and kind of move forward with the problem. So, for this LRU cache example, you might ask questions like, what does it mean for a cache to be least recently used? What kind of data would I store in this cache? What kinds of methods am I going to need to use to access the data in the cache? And once you've gathered that information, hopefully you'll be able to make some progress with the problem. And then the last piece of this that's really important is you want to demonstrate enthusiasm about learning this new concept. And it can be especially powerful if you can sort of reiterate what you've learned about the topic and then connect it to something that you've worked on. You might say, oh, this LRU cache is really interesting. I did a project where I was storing data like blah, 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 and I can see why it would be really useful to only store the items that the user has asked for recently because of blah, blah, blah. And that way you're showing the interviewer not only that you understand the concept that they've explained to you, but also that you're already thinking about how to apply it to things that you're working on. And that's actually going to portray you in a very positive way, even though you weren't initially familiar with this concept. The last thing I'll say about this is a really difficult skill. Interviewing is a difficult skill. And this specific process of kind of tackling something unfamiliar in an interview setting is really challenging. So I would encourage you to practice, maybe find a friend who is also job searching, and you can each kind of spend a little bit of time learning about something new, and then interview each other about that new thing to simulate this experience of being asked about something that you're not familiar with. Next slide. So the next situation that often comes up in interviews is you might feel like you're kind of getting stuck on the problem that you're working on. And something I've noticed is that a lot of candidates tend to stay quiet when they're feeling stuck. And it almost seems like they don't want to say anything until they feel like they've fully figured out an absolutely correct solution to the problem. And the problem with that is that then you can often end up being quiet for quite some time, and you're not giving the interviewer enough insight into your thought process. So as an example, let's imagine that we have a candidate who's working on a problem and they need to store some data, they need to be able to get, add, and remove items, and they want to be able to access the smallest element in their set of data quickly. And this candidate is thinking in their head about different data structures to use, but they're stuck. They can't think of something that's going to work well. And so they're kind of going down a list in their head saying, oh, I could use an array, but that's not going to work because, but they're not doing any of that out loud. The problem with this is that this candidate is actually making some progress with the problem, but the interviewer doesn't know that. And so they might end up giving this candidate a big hint because they're worried that the candidate is floundering. And then the interviewer's feedback is going to reflect that. It's going to say, oh, the candidate, solved the problem, but I had to give them a big hint. So let's compare that with another candidate who is kind of struggling with the same thing, but they do their process of elimination thinking out loud. They don't have a good solution yet, but they're telling the interviewer, well, I know that an array is not a good solution, and here's why. And so this candidate is actually showing a lot of positive things, even though they don't have a correct data structure in mind yet. They're showing that they understand the requirements of the problem. They're showing that they know why an array isn't a good fit for this problem. And so this candidate is actually more likely to get kind of more appropriately scoped small hints from the interviewer and have more positive feedback. And the last thing I want to talk about is being unsure of the syntax. So of course, it's important to be relatively competent in the syntax of the language that you're choosing to code in. Most companies will let you choose the language that you want to use when you're interviewing and solving a problem. But it's also normal that you might want to use methods that aren't that common while you're solving the problem, and you might not be 100% sure of the syntax. And sometimes I know I felt this way when I was interviewing after my boot camp, and I've seen candidates kind of hedge in a similar way. Sometimes folks, when they're not sure of the syntax, tend to just stay away from those methods and approaches altogether because they don't want to seem like they don't know something. And so they just don't mention it at all. And the problem with that is that then you're missing out on an opportunity to kind of show off the full range of your knowledge. So I'll give an example of that. Let's imagine a candidate who's coding in JavaScript and needs to store key value pairs, but also needs to keep track of the insertion order of the keys. And so let's imagine this candidate knows that JavaScript has maps and that maps maintain insertion order, but they aren't sure about the syntax for all the methods when they use maps. And so they decide, I'm just not going to mention maps at all. I'm going to use plain old JavaScript objects. And the problem with that is the interviewer has no idea that this candidate knows about maps. So they're not getting that data about the candidate. Compare that with candidate 2. So candidate 2 is going to say, hey, I could use maps for this. I know that they maintain insertion order, but I'm not familiar with the syntax. Is it okay if I look it up? And so this candidate is showing something really positive. They're showing that they know 2 different ways to store key value pairs in JavaScript, and they know why a map is a better fit for this specific problem. So the interviewer isn't really going to care that they aren't totally 100% sure of the syntax. They're more interested in those kind of more positive conceptual data points. And it's likely that the interviewer might either say, sure, it's fine to look up the syntax, or maybe they don't want to waste time on that. They might just tell you the syntax to use if you don't know it, and they do. And sometimes interviewers will even just say, well, what kinds of methods do you expect to have, and kind of let you make up a syntax as long as it seems reasonable. So those are some of the common problems and kind of ways you can handle them. The last thing I want to talk about is marketing your prior experience. I think a lot of folks who maybe have some previous work experience, but it's not necessarily directly related to software engineering, maybe it's not that technical, tend to kind of downplay their previous experience in interviews, and they just want to focus on showing their coding skills. It's important to show your coding skills, but I definitely want to emphasize that your prior experience is also very valuable. Companies that are hiring people from non-traditional backgrounds are interested in hiring those people because they know that they come with kind of diverse skills that are sometimes different than the skills that, you know, a recent graduate from college with a computer science degree might have. So if you have previous work experience, you know, working with customers or kind of working on the business side of things, that might be really valuable to a company. Maybe you were a manager at a restaurant, then you have experience managing people and, you know, giving feedback. And those kinds of skills are going to be really important because as you level up your coding skills and your software engineering skills, you know, that those other skills make you more prepared for leadership positions. So if the company is looking to eventually promote someone to be an engineering manager or to be a team leader, you know, compared to a recent college grad who doesn't have any work experience, you might already have some of those other skills. So I'll just give an example from my own experience. You know, I was a high school English teacher. And so when I was in interviews, I talked about my students as users. And I emphasized that I had worked with hundreds of students, you know, some of whom had disabilities because I taught special ed, students who were blind or had dyslexia, and we were using technology in the classroom. So I was working with these hundreds of users experiencing these different challenges. And so I had a strong sense of user empathy and, you know, a deep awareness of issues around web accessibility. And so that was something that I kind of emphasized in order to differentiate myself during the job search. And then when I started working at WePay, I was actually able to take the lead on the UI UX team on some of our web accessibility work. So I would definitely encourage you to kind of think creatively about your prior experience and how it could be relevant to the jobs that you're applying for, and don't just dismiss it just because it's not necessarily technical. So yeah, thanks so much. And I'll hand it back to Moira.
All right, awesome. Okay, so we have the Q&A panel. If you didn't get a chance to open up your little Q&A thing, now is the time to do it. I have to escape out of this. Okay, awesome. Okay, so let me pull up the questions. All right, cool. All right, so the way that we're going to do this is basically I'm just going to go through the questions in order from most upvoted to least. And if any, I'll sort of call out people, or if any of you presenters feel particularly inclined to answer, indicate in some way. All right, so the first question is, what sorts of questions can I ask to demonstrate that I'm really interested in the company? Anyone? Smitha, do you wanna take that?
Yeah. So there's not like this, you can't say like, oh, these are the set of questions which will portray that you are interested in the company or something like that. But what generally, like we've been mentioning right now, is this is an opportunity where you can get to know about the company. So you can ask information like, oh, what is the culture of the company looks like, and what is the where do you see the company is aiming towards in the next 5 years, or what is the goal of the company, and what does the everyday work looks like, and all those things. Yeah.
Anyone else have thoughts that they want to share? Sarah, do you want to go?
Sure. I just want to add, a lot of companies have like some kind of engineering blog or resource where they might be, engineers might be writing about the work that they're doing. So I would definitely do that research. And if you can ask some specific questions about things that you found interesting, that you know the company is working on, that can really demonstrate that you kind of are thoughtfully and genuinely interested in that, in the work that's going on there.
Anyone else want to contribute? All right, I'll just mark that as answered. All right, I actually have some opinions about this next one. If I feel like I'm really strong at something, but the question that the interviewer asked doesn't let me demonstrate that, how can I show that strength anyway? I'll let other people take it before I share my thoughts if anyone's interested. Kushbu, do you want to go?
So this is a very good question, and it's really hard to answer this question because you are in a tough spot. Let's say your interview is not going very well, and you think that, hey, this question is out of my domain, and I haven't practiced for it, or I don't know how to answer this. So how do you go about doing that? So there are certain things that you can still do so that you don't get derailed and you still have the interview. Basically making sure that if you're strong at something and the interviewer has asked you something totally opposite, it's important to let the interviewer you can just ask more questions if you don't know what the solution is. Like you should ask more clarifying questions. Tell them, hey, can you tell me more about this? I'm not very familiar with this question, but I'm familiar with certain other things which might be able to connect to the original question. So basically, whatever your strengths are, try to make sure, try that those skill sets somehow fit in to the original questions that are being asked by the interviewer. Again, as Sarah mentioned earlier, it's all about being a little bit creative on how you can fit your strengths into the existing problem that's being asked. But yeah, that's it from me. Moira?
Did anyone else want to contribute before I... Rufa, do you want to go?
As I mentioned before, it's just not about solving a problem, but interviewer is looking for specific data points, and you should just think about scoring points over there. Start with asking requirements, like understand the problem correctly, try to understand the implications of different things, and yeah, basically get, if you ask questions, probably as a conversation, it's possible you may find out a solution yourself. And also once you have it, worst case, you can always write brute force thing. Start with that. If you don't have anything, start with that and try to improve on that as you go, by taking inputs and by conversing with your interviewer. That definitely helps.
Yeah. Yeah, I would also say, like, don't try too hard to maneuver a question into something that makes you feel more comfortable, because then it's totally possible that the interviewer will conclude that you just don't know how to answer the question, and that's why you're trying to maneuver it into something else. A lot of interviewers are trying to get specific data points. So just trying to avoid that isn't really going to do you any favors. If you're having trouble with a question, ask, like other people have said, like, ask questions. But I don't think it's a good idea to try and maneuver a question into something that you feel more comfortable with. So that if it's not actually related to the question that they're trying to evaluate you on. All right. Okay. So Sarah, I think this is probably a good question for you. This is sort of related to the last one. If I feel like I'm totally out of my depth of the question, how can I make a positive impression anyway?
Yeah, I think I touched on that a little bit in the presentation, but I think like other folks have kind of said about the last question, it's important to be just upfront and honest with your interviewer. I would use language that doesn't highlight like I'm totally out of my depth, but more like this is the baseline of what I do know about this topic, and maybe some like other surrounding things that I know, so that you're still talking about what you do know, but you're also making it clear that like there are things that I don't know that need to be filled in for me. And then also just asking really good targeted questions kind of shows your interviewer, this is someone who, when I give them a project to work on that's like challenging for them, they're going to be able to ask good questions to gather all the requirements and all the information that they need. And that can be hard to do if you feel totally out of your depth, but I think there are kinds of common questions that apply to lots of situations, and you can kind of practice thinking about what those are.
Anyone else want to share their thoughts on this question? All right. All right. What are some do's and don'ts for the tell me about yourself question? and those types of questions. Smitha, do you want to go?
Yeah. So I would say, like I said, other than the technical skills, the employer or the interviewer is evaluating you on a soft skills also. So this is an opportunity where you can tell what is the past work that you have done, like any project, college projects or anything, what you have learned. You don't have to be very direct about expressing your behavioral skills and all. You can say, oh, I worked in a project. I worked with a group of people. It was a small group or a big group. How did you manage the work? Or how did, suppose if you worked on some specific project which had like a short deadline or something, then how did you achieve it, or things like that. You can try to tell your interviewer about all these things, which would give an impression about your qualities that the interviewer would not get otherwise. And one thing to make a note over here is, you can't be like, you can't make up these stories and then just say it, because you also sometimes there are like interviewers will ask you to elaborate a little bit more about a specific project or what you have worked on and what is your role in that project or as a team. So you should be able to answer those questions as well. So yeah.
Sarah, go ahead.
Something else I want to add about the tell me about yourself question, be careful about just kind of launching into a regurgitation of your resume. Usually the interviewer has your resume in front of them. They've read it. And so it's much more powerful if you just pick a couple of things that you think are important that you want to highlight. And don't talk for like 10 minutes, because that some people kind of like start talking and they talk for a long time and they don't kind of give the interviewer any opportunity to interject. So try to give like a brief overview of a couple things that you think showcase some important skills that you have. And then you can ask the interviewer, like, do you want me to go into more detail about that?
Sorry, I was looking at other things. Do you want to keep talking? Or Rupa, also you had something.
Yeah. It's going to be definitely beneficial if you try to relate your previous experience with the job role and the requirements. So if you can relate somehow, I mean, if you already have something work in your previous job, which is listed in your job requirement, that's going to be a good point too. I mean, you can relate to it and you can make feel like a better fit for the job.
All right. Also, I see some people typing in the Q&A on Zoom, but I'm not looking there. I'm looking on Slido. So you should, if you want to ask a question, you should do it on Slido, just so you know. All right. Does anyone else want to add anything else to tell me about yourself? Question? All right, I'll mark it as answered. All right. Do you have returnship opportunities? I'm actually not 100% sure what a returnship is. Is this like an internship or returning internship? I'm going to assume it's related to internships. So if we're talking about internships, yes, we do have internship opportunities. I don't know if we're doing internships like sort of during what would be the traditional school year, but next summer, I'm very confident that we will have internship opportunities. So yes. Oh, Sarah, go ahead.
We're also starting for the first time an apprenticeship program. So I'm not totally sure if a returnship falls into that category, but I know internships are usually specifically limited to current students, whereas the apprenticeship is kind of more targeted towards folks coming out of boot camps, or maybe if you're returning to work after some gap year, you might be a good fit for that program as well. So I think we just opened up the application, but I don't have the link. I can try to find it.
Okay. I mean, we do have a jobs page. So if you're curious, if you look for like WePay jobs, I'm sure it will pop up. All right. Assuming no one else has anything they want to say about this, I will mark it as answered. All right. What is the most important attribute a candidate can display? Everyone must have opinions on this, right?
Okay.
Rupa, yeah.
I think I would say we can't just say candidate need to have one skill. It's about overall personality. I would say it's about problem solving skills, your communication, your uh, leadership qualities. Overall, I would say enthusiasm. That's definitely required, especially in the interviews. You need to show enthusiasm to get the job and attend the interviews and things. But yeah, there is no a single rule of thumb. There are different qualities what the interviewer looks for in a candidate.
Anyone else? Right. Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's like a mix. I feel like if I had to pick like one thing that I really want a candidate to be able to display, it's, learning and problem solving. I guess that's sort of two things, but I'm going to consider them sort of intermeshed. I really want a candidate to be able to display that they're able to sort of synthesize information, um, relatively quickly. I feel like that's really, especially in technical interviews, that's, I feel like, what I'm looking for the most. And so sometimes that can be evaluated if they're learning about a concept for the first time, or sometimes it can be evaluated if it's a concept that they are aware of, but it's being used in a slightly different manner. But you can still get the same basic information about their problem solving skills from those two different situations, even for the same question. Oh, just a second. All panelists and attendees. Okay. All right. Cool. Okay, I'm gonna mark this as answered. Okay. I was told to go to every interview, even if I don't want the job. I've been doing that, but then it just gets awkward when I get offered the job and I don't want it. Does anyone have any thoughts on this? Kushbu, go ahead.
I think this has happened to most of us where we are just trying to increase our chances, right? To get an interview and have the best, have all the offers and choose the best for ourselves. So I understand that it is awkward when we are offered a job at a company that we don't want to get hired into. It is, I would say that what is your goal if you're trying to interview at multiple companies? If you're not looking for a job, I understand that you're just trying to see what's out there for you. So there are different agendas that people have when they are trying to interview. Some people are actively trying to look for a job. Some people might just want to interview, and if a good opportunity pops up, they might just take it, or otherwise they're happy with the job that they have right now. So you might be able to fit yourself in one of those categories and determine that, do you actually want to go and give another interview, or are you happy at where you're working at? Are you happy at your current job? So I think it's important that if you are just looking out, if you're just maybe interviewing and see if a good opportunity pops up, you can let your recruiter know about it, that this is what your expectation is from the interview process. It just helps them also understand that that you're just interviewing because you want to know what the opportunity is and want to know more about it. And if suppose you don't want to get, you don't want an offer now, but maybe 6 months down the line, you might be in a better position to move to a different organization or a different company. You can let your recruiter know about that as well.
Smita, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree to that. So I think it's the better way to do it is like communicating with your hiring recruiter to make sure that you're conveying the reason, rather than just make sure you end it in a good note. Even if what if you're definitely, like, people try to interview at multiple places and get offers from multiple companies. So there might be a possibility that you want to try out a different company just to see if it is working out for you or not, right? So you can tell whatever is the reason, genuine reason, And then of course they would understand, and then you can tell them that if it doesn't work out, is it okay if I come back and then approach you guys, and if there is a position available, then maybe they would consider it again, they would re-interview or anything like that. So yeah.
All right, anyone else have thoughts? All right, mark it as answered. All right, I will answer this one. Are you hiring? So we are hiring for some positions. If you go on WePay's job page, that will list all the positions that we're hiring for. If you are looking for a position that isn't listed on that page, I will let you know that we are sort of in the middle of budgeting for a next round of hires. So if you are patient, we may be adding more stuff onto, more jobs on there soon. So yeah. Just a second. Okay. How to explain software projects. So does anyone have any tips on sort of explaining, I assume, like sort of projects that you've worked on previously? Like what do you want to make sure you talk about? What do you maybe don't want to talk about? How do you, are there any tips for describing things that you have worked on? Rupa, are you? Yeah.
I can start off. So when you're explaining about your previous work and the projects you worked on, definitely we want to see what was your role in doing things and how much you have contributed. What were your roles and responsibilities, and what is the impact you have made on the project? Whether you might have increased, worked on performance, might have contributed in a different way. You may want to highlight your impact in the project. So make sure you understand the overall scope of the project, and also basically you should be able to tell that in a layman terms. What was the use case of the project, and what was your role? How you contributed, and how was your team structure? And if there were any challenges you faced when you were working on a particular project, bring them up, and also give instances on how you solved those challenges and how you contributed to that. So these are the points what interviewer would be looking for, and it's good if you highlight these points when you're explaining your project.
Anyone else want to? Kushbu, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Rupa. Those were excellent points on how do you explain your software projects. Another thing that I would like to add to what Rupa just mentioned is practicing about how you will explain your software projects in an interview. It is very, very important that you understand that there's a limited time that you can explain your software, in which you have to explain your software projects. So try to bring down the project into try to bring down explaining your project in a few minutes, where you're able to give away the interviewer a few data points about what was your contribution to the project, what were your learnings from the project, and if you worked with a team, how well you worked with a team in that project. At the same time, it is also important that you make sure that you are not just rambling about a lot of things when you are mentioning your project. Like, you can go in as much depth as you can about your project. I mean, that's something that all of us sometimes do, where you might spend 1 hour about explaining your project, but it's still not complete. But that's not the point in an interview. In an interview, you are trying to give the interviewer as many data points. So try to practice about how you will explain your software projects.
Yeah, it's also important we keep different layers when explaining, like top level, and then if we get into one more detailed level, then we should go more deeper. And if we get further deeper down, probably we should be able to explain everything, including the coding and the technology decisions we made, everything. So having different versions of these projects are going to be helpful at different coding interviews, depending on how much interested the interviewer is.
All right. Any other thoughts? All right, let's mark that one as answered. All right, should we mention if we know anyone or were referred by anyone in the company? I can talk about this if no one is particularly interested. So, I mean, the recruiters will know. I don't think it's like you don't have to mention it to your interviewers. It won't hurt you if you do, but I mean, like, it's not something it's hopefully not something that will change how they evaluate you at all. I will say, like, if you are saying that, you're really looking forward to working with, the person who referred you, that can show interest in the company. But other than that, I mean, it doesn't really matter if you do or don't. Anyone else want to share any other thoughts?
To add what Moira said, I think the intent of mentioning that someone who works in the company, or you were referred by someone in the company, is just so that you can let the interviewer know that you're interested in the company and you've got to know about certain projects that this person is working on, or that just show your enthusiasm towards working for the company. That's more than enough if you're mentioning about you were referred by someone.
Yeah, that's fair. All right, I will mark that one as answered. All right. If I don't disclose graduation year on the resume, will I still be asked about it and why I didn't put it on my resume? If I say that I'm not comfortable, will it reduce my chance of getting hired? I can take this one, I guess. So obviously, like, I feel like I would hope that, like, you wouldn't get harassed as to why you didn't put your graduation year on your resume. I feel like the primary reason you would want to avoid putting it on is because you're concerned about, like, age discrimination, which is illegal, obviously. So, I would hope that no recruiters will, be forcing you to disclose that information, because it would put you in a protected class potentially. So yeah, and I don't, we talked sort of a little bit about, like, the importance of the resume to individual interviewers, and I would hope that, like, no individual interviewers would particularly care about the year that you graduated. Especially if you have, like, prior experience and you're not, like, a recent graduate, that's much more important information on a resume than, like, graduation year. So
Yeah, I agree to what Moira said. So interviewer would only be looking at the top level details. I mean, if you have graduated or if you have a master degree. So this is helpful for the interviewer to set certain benchmarks to judge you when you are interviewing. Yeah, definitely we interview the benchmarks to judge a new fresher or a new grad is definitely going to be different from what a person with a good amount of experience. Pretty much that's all the interviewer cares, and definitely not the year you graduated, or yeah, those details don't matter much.
all right.
I think to add to that, the last point, make sure that you get information from your recruiter what position that you will be interviewing for, because that's how you will be judged. Like as Rupa mentioned, that at WePay we have different levels of software engineers, and that's how we have our evaluation criteria as well. So it's very important for you to know exactly what position you will be interviewing for. That helps you prepare well for the interview.
All right. I'm gonna mark that one as answered. All right. Hi, any tips on how to approach questions about gaps in my employment? Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of similar to the last question, the person who's interviewing you likely isn't, like, making a timeline out of your resume. So they're kind of more interested in what skills you do have. And so anything you can do to just highlight and put the emphasis on that rather than on any gap. I mean, I think it also, like if you took a gap for some like cool and interesting reason, I would feel free to like be upfront and highlight that. If you had a gap for like a more personal reason that you feel like isn't something you want to talk about in the interview, I would just shift the focus to the skills that you have. If you have, don't have recent work experience, but you have some cool personal projects, or you contributed to some open source project, you can talk about that. And if the interviewer like directly asks you about, what about this project you did at this company, and it's actually something you did 7 years ago and you don't remember it that well, I think it's okay. Like if it's on your resume, you should be prepared to talk about it a little bit, but it's okay to also kind of try to shift the focus and say, I'd actually love to tell you about like this project that I did recently. It was, a more personal project, but I worked with these technologies that I was really excited about, and you can try to start talking about that.
All right. Any other thoughts? All right, I will mark that one as answered. So the next question is also related to, so Avani unfortunately is not here with us for the Q&A, so we can't answer the perspective of a hiring manager, but we did just talk about employment gap. So the other part of this is, so the full question is, what would the perspective of a hiring manager on a candidate with an employment gap? How to tackle behavioral questions related to the gap? So like I said, unfortunately, we don't have a Vani. If anyone wants to talk about sort of questions of like, the stuff that Avani talked about is behavioral, concerns during interview. Does anyone want to talk about that? I guess like I just kind of want to reiterate like what Sarah said, like, you should be honest about like the reasons that you took a gap. Like there's lots of perfectly normal reasons people take employment gaps. But you can none of those necessarily make you like a worse employee or like a worse coworker though. So I guess I would say like behavioral questions related to the gap. Like I don't necessarily think that like an employment gap would necessarily lead to like concerns about the behavior, like how effective a coworker can someone be. I think it's much more common that employment gaps result in like technical, them being less confident technically in an interview. So I guess that's what I would say. Sarah, go ahead.
I guess just to add like a more concrete example that friends of mine and I have talked about before, like I know some women have like taken a gap while they have young children, and some folks are like afraid to explicitly say that in the interview because they think that, the company then might think like, oh, you're going to prioritize your family, which is awful. And I think,
and that's also, it's also worth noting that like some of the things that would force you, I guess, to take a gap are protected classes. And so you can choose to not reveal that information to your employer.
Yeah, so it's definitely your choice, but I would say like personally, if I was interviewing someone, I mean, I would probably never explicitly ask them like, why do you have this gap on your resume? But if I did and they like didn't want to answer, that would seem more weird to me than if they said like, oh, I had young children, so I took a couple years off. And like Moira mentioned, the concern might be like, is your technical competency still where it needs to be? And if you can demonstrate that in the interview, no one should care that you took a gap year or two to take care of your child. And if they do care, you don't want to work at that company.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. All right, I'm gonna mark this as answered unless anybody else has any other thoughts. All right, so we are getting down to the wire. I sort of scheduled 30 minutes. We are right about 30 minutes because we ended sort of at 6:05. So I'm going to just answer one final question. So that would be, this is the one that's at the top, even though they're all equal. How can I show my interviewer that I'm interested in the job? I actually kind of feel like we covered this one a bit, so I'm gonna say that this one's already answered. So this is sort of covered in Sarah's presentation, but what are some suggestions for people changing careers and coming from different careers into tech? How can one leverage our non-tech skills into the role? Sarah, do you want to take that?
I mean, I'd be curious if anyone else has things to add that I didn't already talk about. But if not, I can just you know, software engineering obviously involves lots of coding, but like it also involves these other really important things, you know, communication, giving and receiving feedback. You know, you might be doing a code review process. Just being able to communicate your planning clearly, being able to kind of balance multiple projects at the same time. And so even if you had a prior job that had nothing to do with software engineering at all, you have some of those other kinds of skills. So you can try to draw connections between the specific things that you did and how they relate to some of those other pieces of the work that aren't explicitly coding, but are kind of coding adjacent.
All right, cool. And actually I lied because I see a question that I like that I want to answer. So, what are some questions I can ask to know if a company is woman friendly? For example, if the culture is not too bro-y. Does anyone want to take this one?
I can answer this.
Sure.
Probably there is no straightforward way to say this until you start working with that, but you can get a general glimpse, see the technical representation of women from that company, maybe technical blogs or the technical talks, what's given outside. So that's going to be a good thing. And also there are going to be technical interviewers who are females as well. So when you get to talk to them, probably you may ask them the question directly and may get a better sense on how things work in a particular company.
Khushbu.
Yes, I think this is a challenge that all the women in the tech industry face today, where we want to know what is the diversity in the organization or in the team that you'll be working with. I think being upfront about it and asking direct questions to your hiring manager, if suppose you get an offer from a company and you're talking to a hiring manager, asking them about the diversity that they have on their teams. If they say that they do not have such a diverse set of people who are working in the team, the next question that you should ask is, what are you doing to make sure that you have more diverse candidates that you're interviewing and more diverse candidates that you're trying to hire, not just in your own team, but as a company or as an organization, what are the steps that you're taking towards it? So these are certain things that give you that give you some information about how much the company or the organization cares about diversity.
Yeah. Anybody else want to share their thoughts on this topic? I'll share a couple of thoughts. So I definitely agreed, like asking your interviews explicitly if they, you know, what the diversity is like on the team that you're joining or the company as a whole is really good. If, you know, basically for no one in the Valley is it particularly that great. So definitely following that up with asking like, what are your, like, how are you encouraging diversity at your company is really useful. Another really good sign is like the diversity of the people who are interviewing you. It can be a good sign. I know that, for example, WePay tries to make sure that every single like interview setup we do, like everyone who interviews with us interacts with at least like one woman, for example. So that can be a good sign. Trying to get a sense of like what, if anything, like how the team you will be joining on socializes can be a good sign, or like, a good signal. Like if they all go to the bar or something after work, that sounds a little bro-y to me, so that's good to know. Figuring out what the expectations are around like flexible work hours and stuff can also be a good sign. Those are some things that I think it's important to ask about. All right. Okay. I think that is our time. So I'm gonna close this out. Jody, I don't know if you want to have anything to sort of tie everything up, or.
Yeah. I just wanted to thank you all for coming out and talking and these great topics that you have. It's nice to hear all of your topics and great tips that you have. So yeah, I appreciate you coming out, and I know there's a lot of interest in the jobs and apprenticeship, and I feel like we had some great questions. So I really appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you for, giving us an audience.
Yeah, I felt like it was really nice. So thank you again.
All right, awesome. Thank you. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.